what happens is that the academics and the sort of intellectual journalists all of a sudden take their cue from these very emotional protest events. So instead of these protest events being motivated by the writings of a Karl Marx or some equivalent New Left intellectual, in fact, the New Left intellectuals were largely playing catch-up, and they were riffing and surfing off the emotions that were created by these on-the-ground social movements. And all of a sudden, the black people had the cultural power, not the wealth or the economic power, but the cultural power. And this was very noticeable. And also the institutions, which were run largely by whites, had to signal that they weren't the bad whites, they were the good whites. So they did this through adopting policies like affirmative action, which were never really necessarily meant to achieve a concrete goal, like really improve the outcomes for black people, but mainly about alleviating this white guilt and signaling that you were not one of the racist whites. I don't think identity per se is necessarily the problem, but it's so much as a victimhood-based identity that gets very radical, where you're all about hating the oppressor. And so you take a very cartoonish view of your enemy as the oppressor, and you dehumanize them.
Welcome, Eric Kaufmann, to the podcast.
Thanks, Mia, for having me.
Now, you and I are colleagues of a sort, I believe. We're both senior fellows at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Is that correct?
That's right.
Right. So you're a Canadian living in Britain, and I'm a Brit living in Canada. We're kind of the reverse.
Yeah, these. Now, just to confuse the audience, right?
Right. Well, I think we'll start there because probably quite a few of our viewers won't have heard of you. So could you give us a quick introduction, who you are and what you do?
Yes, my name's Eric Kaufmann. I'm a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham here in England, from Vancouver originally, and a fellow at MLI. I did a report on the politics of the culture wars in Canada in 2024. And so, I have a keen interest in both societies as well as the US. And I write a lot about the politics of culture, whether that be around populism and polarization, or whether it be around the culture war issues such as cancel culture or critical race and gender ideology.
What got you invited on the podcast was that amazing thread. I think it was back in May that you wrote an amazing thread on Twitter that went with a Wall Street Journal article, right? So I loved it because you talk about wokeness in a much broader historical context, which is how I approach the trans issue. It only makes sense to me if I put the whole madness into a much broader timeline. And so in your thread, you said we are entering the end of the progressive era. Not just the end of woke, but the end of the progressive era. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so I think it's partly because when you're swimming with the current, you don't realize there's a current. And we all grew up in this current, and so it's hard to step out of it and see that it's historically specific. Progressive, by that I mean cultural left, essentially, which by that I mean the idea of equal outcomes between groups as defined by identity, typically race and sex, but also increasingly sexual orientation. And that's been the politics since the 1960s, actually. It's interesting to go back. I mean, somebody posted a piece from Richard Nixon's autobiography talking about the idea of Shakespeare as racist in the 1960s. And actually, you can find spots of what we would recognize as woke in the 60s in places like Berkeley and places soon after like Toronto, and in the epicenters. And I think what we actually are living through in the 2010s was simply a scaling up and expanding and scope expansion of all these ideas. But the ideas are actually not that different. So we've had 60 years. You think of a policy like affirmative action, racial preferences for blacks in contracting, in admittance to university and hiring. That starts up really in the end of the 60s. The ideas from the mid 60s. you think about, so that's like 60 years. That just got rescinded. That 1965 affirmative action executive order got rescinded by Trump almost 60 years later. This is not simply about rolling back mandatory diversity statements and other phenomenon from the Great Awakening of the 2010s. It's going back much further than that. And similarly with the what's called disparate impact, if there is a test, let's say a scholastic aptitude test where one race does more poorly than another, the idea that that represents some kind of indirect discrimination or what's called disparate impact, that became law in 1971, which is almost 55 years ago. That is now going to be, that's in the crosshairs to be removed. In fact, there's already been some executive action on that in the Trump administration. So we're talking about questioning things that have been around not just 10 years, but 50, 60 years. And I'm arguing in a way that this whole era of the progression of the cultural left, and I'm not saying it didn't do some good things, but the overreach and the extremism that we're seeing is part and parcel of a whole set of ideas which we don't recognize because we're just in it. But it's a very specific ideology. It's not Marxism. It's not kind of economic socialism. It is cultural socialism. And so that's what I was talking about.
Right. We'll get to that later because you and
Yeah.
James Lindsay disagree, and I'm really fascinated by that comparison. But you called it the moral. Do you call it the moral Big Bang? Did the moral Big Bang or so happen in the 1960s? What was the trigger? What exactly triggered that?
Well, this is the thing: is that you're coming out of an inch of a period where there is real racism, real discrimination
Mm.
against women and gays, and all that. And the problem is when you come out of that era, the question is how do you come out of it? And the first major step was the civil rights movement, which captures the imagination. As Shelby Steele, who's the African American scholar who lived through this, wrote a book called White Gills, and he lived in the Jim Crow South, and he says, well, it used to be that black people used to kowtow to white people, and the whites had all of the cultural power, and then all of a sudden, in the space of a very few years, at least at the elite level, it switched very quickly, and all of a sudden, the black people had the cultural power, not the wealth or the economic power, but the cultural power, and this was very noticeable. And also the institutions, which were run largely by whites, had to signal that they weren't the bad whites, they were the good whites. So they did this through adopting policies like affirmative action, which were never really necessarily meant to achieve a concrete goal like really improve the outcomes for black people, but it was mainly about alleviating this white guilt and signaling that you were not one of the racist whites. So it was all about reclaiming moral authority. And that, I think, was a very interesting idea from Steele. So that's the idea, is that this race taboo, and you have a bunch of taboos which suddenly emerge where it's not just not being racist, but it's there's always this suspicion which you've got to dispel, that you're one of the bad racist whites. And there's a taboo. It's like a social death, to use John McWhorter's term, to be accused of racism. And that's coming in the mid-60s in respectable high cultural circles. And it's very either or, very black and white, very totalizing, and it's not nuanced. And once that occurs, that I call that the Big Bang of our moral universe. And everything has been an sort of development out of that Big Bang. And it means that as long as you can weaponize and key into that narrative of racism and white guilt, then gives you a lot of power. It's like kryptonite in Superman. You can kind of wield it to get somebody to shrink away. And so you wield it. Of course, there's a big incentive in it. And you stretch the meaning of racism, and it includes being on time and scientific and everything else. And then from there, of course, others see the power, and you get feminism borrowing it, you get the gay, you get trans borrowing it. And I guess other people try to borrow it too, but the number of groups that are sacred is limited. And so, yes, fat people and deaf people and all these others, yes, they are borrowing it, but it's not as much of a taboo. Whereas the race, gender, sexual identity stuff is really the sacred, holy trinity. and has been the Trinity for 60 years. And it's just that it's become more and more intense with each sort of fundamentalist awakening that's occurred. And we're in our third one. The first one was in the late 60s. Second one was in the late 80s, early 90s, when the term political correctness was devised, and Eurocentrism in these terms. And then the Great Awakening of the 2010s and early 20s was the third major one, which really saw these ideas spread off campus into the newspapers, for example, and into institutions in a much bigger way.
Could I ask, you said, let's say this, and I buy it, I like your framing here. Like, let's say the last 60 years is kind of the, I just thought I'd tell you. I buy what you're selling.
Okay.
Yeah, like, imagine, right, you're saying last 60 years progressiveness was the thought order of the day. What was before that, and how long did it last? And how do you know we're in the dying days of it?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, we are not in the dying days. So, I hate to dispel that optimism. I think we're at an inflection point, where the ball has been thrown in the air and it's reached a peak, and it's looks like it might be coming down. Okay, so we don't know how long that's going to take. The first half of the 20th century was a period in which, you did have some progressivism, and so it's this sort of seedbed for what came later, but it wasn't able to dominate institutions. So, for example, the liberal progressive movement was very much about defending immigrants and talking about the fact that, the U.S. isn't just an Anglo-Protestant dominated culture, but it's got many different groups, each of which are contributing. And it did, however, I mean, it was dismissive of the ethnic majority group. So that is a continuity with the present. And it was more focused on the European immigrant groups, the Jews and Italians and other immigrant groups, than it was on African Americans. That's another difference.
But what was the thinking of the day, if you follow me? If progressiveness was our theme, what was their theme? Yeah.
It's very complicated because progressive originally in the 1890s, 1880s, it combined some things we would recognize, an emphasis on women's rights, on alleviating poverty, with, for example, prohibiting alcohol, restricting immigration, not liking city. So it mixed together things we might think of as populist right with things we would think of as left wing. By the time we get from the 1890s, there's a big change from like 1890 to the 1910s. By the 1910s, you're getting this liberal version of progressivism, which is kind of more focused on the kind of empathy for minorities part of the picture, and to some degree the threat from majorities, which in the 1920s in the US, they enacted some restrictive immigration laws, for example. So they were kind of shifting. And so I think the beginnings of the modern progressive outlook are in that first and second decade of the 20th century, which then go on to influence particularly the ecumenical movement in Protestantism and the mainline denominations, the Federal Council of Churches, in the 1910s and 20s. So you get this kind of liberal pluralist elite, which is in the sort of mainline Christian churches and in academia to some degree. Again, things like eugenics, which had been popular, scientific racism, was starting to lose power like in the 1910s and become replaced by this more relativist outlook. So there were shifts going on in the high culture, in between the wars, actually. But I would still say the emphasis was more on kind of cultural, what I call modernism, that is anti-tradition, expressing yourself, being an individual. There was a little bit of kind of class-based socialism, but the identity politics stuff really is not there in any serious way, actually. And even the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, the left is not really driving that. It's actually, and more Republicans voted for it than Democrats. It wasn't clearly any kind of identity politics movement. That would be a mistake to read the civil rights movement as that. It's only after the civil rights movement that suddenly this becomes a big sensibility in the world of arts and letters, and the left jumps on it. And you get something. So 1966, you have Susan Sontag, who was writing for Partisan Review, which was an influential non-communist left-wing magazine, probably one of the most influential in the US, and comes up with these statements like white people are the cancer of human history, like these statements which totally come out of nowhere. And sound exactly modern. That's exactly how Sarah Jung or Nicole Hannah-Jones would speak.
And
It was
what
already
year was
there,
that? What year did she write that?
1966.
Okay.
So very quickly, all of a sudden, people noticed that in one summer, Paul Krugman writes, like in one summer, the taboos, the norms, people had these front grills on their suburban homes where they had pictures of or black coachmen in metal, and they painted them all white. Just like one summer, this taboo came in, and everything was no longer acceptable. All the norms shifted one summer. I think that's kind of the Big Bang, really, that we're talking about. So you had these events, the civil rights movement, and later you had, of course, these identity movements for, first the civil rights and then black radicalism, Malcolm X, and then you had and the Black Panthers in the late 60s. And then you had, of course, radical feminism coming in the late 60s. You had the gay rights movement in the late 60s, early 70s. What happens is that the academics and the sort of intellectual journalists all of a sudden take their cue from these very emotional protest events. So instead of these protest events being motivated by the writings of a Karl Marx or some equivalent New Left intellectual, in fact, the New Left intellectuals were largely playing catch-up, and they were riffing and surfing off the emotions that were created by these on-the-ground social movements. And so they are, in some ways, downstream of events and empowered by the events, and they're trying to rationalize the events because they like the emotions, and they emotionally identify, and their imaginations have been captured by these narratives and movements and images. And I think that's kind of the story of the cultural left, is kind of playing catch up. If you look at that 2001 Critical Race Theory edited volume from Delgado and Stefanchik, if you look at the foreword there, they're talking about being influenced by activism. And so the scholars are coming after the activism. They're not actually influencing the activism so much. They are trying to package it and trying to intellectualize something that has kind of got a more pre-conscious emotional origin.
But then I was thinking about this, and Stella, you can jump in here as well. But Eric, this question for you. Do you think trends is the other way around? Do you think trends was an idea that gave rise to the event, the contagion, the epidemic of trends? That, to me, it seems like it's the other way around.
I guess the question to ask here is, did Judith Butler or some equivalent give rise to the trans movement?
I think trans activism did.
And so I guess the question is, where did trans activism emerge from? Of course, this is quite new. Well, it is and it isn't, but it does seem to me that its influence is it was very niche before. I guess the bottom line is this a intellectualizing movement, or is it a sort of empathizing movement? Is it sort of what they call systemizing or empathizing? Driven by emotions from below, or is it driven by idea systems and models from above? And I'm not sure if I could name the intellectual that really gave this the push.
Well, I wouldn't call him an intellectual, but I would put it on Martin Rothblatt and his crazy idea, the apartheid of sex in 1994, and the creation of gender identity ideology, and then they just launch it into mainstream culture, and then they triggered the event. Do you agree, Stella, or am I just sounding completely insane right now?
I'll be honest, I'm just keeping up with both of you, so go on, Eric. But I do have questions, but I'm thinking.
But if you look at there's different levels, right? So if you look on social media, the term trans, if you look at academic articles using the term trans, it's all really late. Really late in the 2010s, it spurts up. One thing that's interesting with trans is the number of mentions explodes in both academia and the media and social media at the same time. And so I think maybe in our day, when everything is on social media, things maybe influence each other more quickly than in the 60s or some time, right, where people had to read the books. And then, so I think, whereas if you look at something like race or feminism, it was being talked about a lot in academic journals already in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Very little in the New York Times and the mainstream media. Very little. Like a term like racism. You look at the number of mentions of a term like racism, big in academia, not much in the media. Then in the 2010s, the line for media on sexism and racism converges. So stuff which had been really talked about a lot already in academia now got talked about in the press. And well, one reason is that social media now links academics and journalists together much more closely. So the trends can move off campus much more quickly than before. But trans is hard because trans is in the social media age. It's a child of the social media age. And so it's hard to pick apart the chicken and egg when everything's happening all at once on trans.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I just see there's no grassroots. Like with feminism, there was the grassroots movement, and they fought for decades and decades, and then it launches. Gay rights, same thing. Civil rights, trans just exploded, ready-made, which to me suggests it's formulated, it's orchestrated, and then the event begins.
Yeah, I guess.
There's
Yeah, go
something
ahead.
to add to it. Activism is very disproportionately represented among autistically minded people because they're narrow-minded. They can be experts. They can fight their case. They don't handle other people's theory of mind very well. So they're very well suited to activism, and they are inclined towards it. And now that I've studied trans in extraordinary depth, I've realized just how autistically minded so many of them from way, 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 way back. I realized that that's actually a common trait all the way through. I think that it's completely inappropriate to say that's just newly these are autistically minded. They always were. That's the point. Narrow-minded, fixated. And if you think about it, when you look at, let's say, the first ever documentary on trans in the BBC, 1980, amazing documentary. I'll look up the title and I'll tell it to you in a minute. Really phenomenal, fantastic. And they follow a man who transitions to a woman in 1980, follow him every 7 years, 1987, then 1994, then 2001. And it turns out that in 1980, when he transitioned in 1980, he got genital surgery. Something like 3 weeks after the programme went out, he was walking down Oxford Street in London, had a collapse, was brought into a hospital. They didn't realise he was a man. They thought he was a woman because he'd had his genital surgery. And they disfigured him. He collapsed. It was some sort of, bleeding happened. I don't know what happened. Some sort of genital surgery thing happened. And he never recovered really from that, but he kept it secret. He was autistically minded and he was determined that he wasn't going to let the trans side down. So he became this famous, trans person who had this secret that it had been a complete disaster. But not only that, so he kept it up in 1987 and then 1994. And, he was keeping a secret that it was a disaster. But I really do recommend this
Okay.
book. He took on single-handedly his place of work for the freedom to go to the toilet where he wanted, in the girls. He took on, this place of work for this. Everywhere he went, he, in a very autistically minded way, he was a single-minded activist. And I was realizing he's representative of so many autistic, activist, trans people out there who were each taking on their schools, their workplaces. Every one of them were like one-man activist shows, if you follow me. And then they found each other on social media. But they were actually very activist orientated for themselves in a way that I think a lot of us couldn't quite conceive, that they will give their life to these court cases, that they get the recognition that they are a woman. So I think that is relevant.
Yeah. I mean, I think you put your finger on a psychological profile, right? And
Yeah.
of those early. That was it's fascinating. I'd be interested to know, first of all, I would hazard a guess that a lot of these employers would roll over even then. I'd be interested
They
to
did.
know if they did, because
They
my
did.
theory is that these doors actually have been open for a long time. It's just the activists haven't thought to push on them. The resistance has always been weak and poor to the cultural socialism, whether it be race, gender, sexuality, or whatever. The question, I suppose, is where they got their ideas from. And this is maybe where the dispute is I'm not sure whether they would have read necessarily the theorists, that they may have picked up these, but there's a bunch of things going on, right? I mean, one is you've got those individuals you're talking about. Another is you have the doctors who are doing these surgeries who are getting, now they may be more plugged into some of the postmodernist or gender ideology ideas, perhaps, and so then you have the youth phenomenon, which is really the big, large in terms of numbers and mass. That's where the numbers are. The young people, again, I think would be highly unlikely to have read serious ideas, but they might be getting a kind of bastardized version through Tumblr, and I guess this question of the vulgarization of these ideas into Tumblr and into Twitter, is a question. But I guess ultimately there's the germination of these ideas, and then there's their social contagion on social media or on some other platform, which emerges in the 2010s. Clearly, that technology is important just to get that many people familiar with the idea. Oh, I'm born in the wrong body, which is it's not a particularly intellectual idea, but so I think it depends where we're focusing. Are we focusing on the germination of the ideas or the transmission?
Right. May I make my case, and then I'll feel like we can move on. I don't think I've made it clearly, and then
I just want to throw out. It's called A Change of Sex for anybody who wants to watch that. I just looked it up. It's
Oh, good.
Okay.
1979.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, let me draw the timeline, and then we'll move on to something else. So here's the way I see it. Paul McHugh shut down John Money's gender clinic in 1979, and that sort of robbed these people of their medical treatment. And so they all get together, trans-identified people, they're desperate for the hormones and surgeries. They form what we now know as the modern trans rights movement. And then a whole bunch of them, and it sounds conspiratorial, but they really did do this. They all get together in these little conferences and they draw up gender identity ideology. So this is the idea that what makes you a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl is a gender identity, which is the foundation of modern trans activism. And then they just lay the legal groundwork. They have a meeting in Jakarta in 2006, and they draw up the blueprint for modern trans activism because they know gay rights is coming to an end, and they know that they're going to launch as soon as it does. So as soon as gay rights is won, they just launch full force. They push this messaging into schools, into policy, into all governments around the world can look to Joe Jakarta. They're like, these people say that men are women and children can be born in the wrong body. We don't have any idea what we're doing, but Joe Jakarta principles, it's right here. We're going to base all of our policy on this document. And then they really kick into high gear with Caitlyn Jenner, Laverne Cox, and Time Magazine, and then they launch, and then the event begins. That's my theory.
I think that sounds totally convincing to me. The one thing I would add is you can be two things. So on the supply side, what you're talking about, really important, but equally, there's been an explosion in female bisexual identity, for example, amongst young people. It's more than doubled, and they have also got very high rates of mental illness. And so I think what you had was kind of an opening up of, you got to be new, different, and oppressed. You got to have an identity, and I think this was part of what was in the air. That kind of maybe interacted with the stuff you're talking about to lead to a big explosion in particularly girls identifying as trans.
And social media, the technology, that's your perfect storm.
Yeah.
Can I go back to, you said something about people painting out the black figures on their fences or something, this big taboo that just springs into being. Was there the same thing? I've never seen that. I've never seen gay rights in that way. Was there a taboo in the gay rights era that you couldn't, it was all of a sudden it was a terrible thing to be homophobic, or was that more incremental?
It's interesting because in Krugman's New York Times articles in 2013, he said something like for gays was occurring that had occurred for race in the mid 60s. That was his claim in this book, or not in this book, in this
Before
article.
you go, before you
Yeah, this was in this New York Times piece by Paul Krugman in 2013, and he said that all of a sudden prejudice against black people became totally unacceptable in any civilized circles, and you had all of these homes on Long Island, which I guess were the fancy homes that had these these gates, and they had statues of black coachmen as part of on the gates. Some of them did, and then all of a sudden they painted them all white in one
And
summer.
when was that? What summer
Yeah,
was it they painted them white?
1965, around
Yeah.
1965,
But
which
there was no moment like that in gay rights, was there? Was there a moment when suddenly it was totally taboo to be homophobic? Or I just see it as being far more gradual.
maybe at the AIDS crisis, though, did it suddenly become completely?
I think you're right about the gradual nature and fuzzier nature of that. I think that's right. It's not, there wasn't any one moment like civil rights or something that really galvanized the imagination and suddenly led to this taboo. So, yeah, I agree with that.
You've touched on this already, but you have these three waves of, what would we call it? Progressive liberalism? What are we calling these three waves?
These would be essentially three awakenings. I'm sort of borrowing the term from the Protestant Great Awakenings, these upsurges of fundamentalist fervor. I would call it like cultural left awakenings. Each of these, so that we were in the third cultural left awakening, based around race, sex, sexuality. The sexuality part was a bit less evident in the first awakening, but it was definitely there in the second and third. And then the trans thing is, of course, only a phenomenon of the third awakening. So there is some new bits that have been added on, but it's pretty much the race and gender part are really at the core.
And so the third one is the one that's gone completely mad. And do you think that because they went too far, they're bringing the whole thing down with them?
Yes. So they went too far to some degree in the second awakening, and everyone was joking and making fun of political correctness. Well, I say everyone, that was still the highbrow magazines, the New Republics, and McNeil Lehrer NewsHour on, was that CNN? I'm trying to remember back now. But 1991, they were writing its obituary, definitely, of course, prematurely, as we found out. And they said, "Oh, the courts have knocked down these speech codes that universities have. They've ruled them unconstitutional. But of course, if the universities want to defy the law, they'll defy the law," and they did. And so, this, in fact, nothing changed. And what's happening? Yeah, in this third awakening, they went so crazy. And of course, it's interesting. There's two things going on. I mean, one is that if you look at affirmative action and the different U.S. court cases, it was gradually being tightened up. With each case, like 2003. The 2003 court case, they had to use this diversity rationale. And then by the time you got to Harvard versus Students for Fair Admissions, the original rationale for affirmative action was somehow that you were going to remove unequal treatment, and it was only a temporary measure. So there was a degree to which this thing was on thin ice. And then, of course, the composition of the court moved in a more conservative direction.
And when was the Harvard case?
2024, I believe. And so you had some things happening. The court was moving in a more conservative direction, but also the Republican Party no longer was as focused on foreign policy and religious issues as it was in the past. So it could focus more on these issues like affirmative action. So a whole constellation of stuff occurs. At the same time, you have the social justice movement going crazy, cancel culture, critical race theory in the New York Times giving the winning this, what prize was it again? It was the journal. What's the Pulitzer Prize for Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 project, which is just gobbledygook from a historical point of view. So
What is that? Can you explain
so
it?
that is basically arguing that the founding date of the American nation state was 1619, the importation of the first slave, rather than 1776, the American Revolution. Um, Arguing that slavery was the reason for the American Revolution. And anyway, very fringe arguments. Fine to make a fringe argument, but it's extremely weak in terms of the historical evidence. All of these holes were picked in it by anyone who's a historian who knows anything. It still wins because it catches the emotional mood, and it's the same principle as the set of hoax papers that Helen Pluckrose and Peter that if you make the right emotional noises, then you get all the accolades, even if you're talking total nonsense. So it's just eventually people called out the emperor's new clothes, and now the New York Times looks foolish and is kind of trying to backpedal from some of the excesses. But yeah, so that's sort of kind of cracked. I think it helped to break the aura of inevitable virtue, and that this is the direction of history, and that you had to be on the right side of that history. I just think that whole storyline took a real beating as a result of these excesses. And then you have, of course, trans, which is really a decisive loss for the cultural left, and in fact, probably the only loss they've had in 60 years, decisively. I mean, they're losing on affirmative action as well, but in public opinion, for a public opinion to really roll back 20 points against the trans activist position in the last 2-3 years, I struggle to think of any other issue they've lost in public opinion like that.
Yeah, it's an extra level of crazy for sure. I've long predicted that it will bring down all the woke nonsense, just because trans is so completely insane that how could as soon as people really understand what's happening, they're going to turn against it. And I know, because I was a trans woman, a women for a while, not really believing it, but as soon as I figured out that they meant trans women were really women, and that we had to really believe that they were women, I stopped believing it. But then I started to think, are all white people racist? Like, I started to question all of the other silly woke beliefs that I had just accepted, along with trans women and women.
Yeah, because really, at heart, what this belief system is about is you have to protect the weakest, and you have to have equal outcomes between strong and weak. I mean, roughly, crudely. But now, of course, that's then intersected with, well, we only really care about race, gender, and sexual identity. The other stuff like weight and mental illness and intelligence and all this stuff, okay, yes, we kind of do, but it's sort of peripheral, or it's not as sacred. So it's really the intersection of the kind of what Jonathan Haidt would call the kind of care harm protective ethos and the equality ethos intersected with the three main identity categories. And anything around that is just sacred, and you touch that at your peril. So,
can we talk about James Lindsay? Do you have a
sure.
question before we move
Yeah.
on to James? Stella, do you have anything?
No, I have a question after James. It'll be a spur.
Because I've been reading James's work for a long time. I've been following James for a long time. So James's framework is that all of this sprang out of neo-Marxism, I suppose. The origins are the Frankfurt School, and it's an oppressor-oppressed battle. It's neo-Marxism, whereas you completely disagree. Am I correct?
Not completely.
And okay, could you do me a favor? Could you steelman James's argument and then say why you disagree with it?
So what I would say is his argument I'm going to put this in crude terms, is that you had the Marxist oppressor-oppressed console. If you imagine an old video game console, we pull out the class cartridge and we stick in the identity cartridge. That is kind of, at a very simple level, what he's talking about. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And Chris Rufo, who borrows or is influenced a lot by James Lindsay, makes a similar argument. It takes it further in a way. And so he's talking about the march through the institutions, the war of position, all of these Gramscian cultural Marxist reference points. that kind of presumes a couple of things. I mean, one, that the goal is radical transformation for a kind of Marxist, for a socialist society. And what you want to do is destroy the existing order, have a revolutionary change. Now, in this case, through winning the minds of young people by taking over education. Again, a lot of truth to that. So it's really about this kind of radical desire to transform society. And yeah, I think if I'm to steelman that, I think we can look at everything Rufo talks about, that the number of people who cite Paulo Freire in education schools, the fact that these books are heavily cited in academia. That's all true. And some of the education school curricula filtering into the head teachers and into the curriculum to some degree, that's all true. It's true that there's a connection between Angela Davis and the Black Panther movement and BLM through some personnel, through a lot of the ideas around decarceration, around the idea that the US Constitution is a mask for systemic racism. So all of these ideas have been around a long time, and there's no question that there is truth to them. And so I've never said that there is no truth to them, or even that they aren't substantially the case. My contention is not that. My contention is simply this, that to explain the spread and the success. So there's a lot of ideas out there being pushed. Communism, why hasn't that, notwithstanding Mamdani, why hasn't that taken over? So there have been plenty of Marxists in universities and pushing those ideas, probably hiring other Marxists. It's not really ever managed to take control of, the bureaucracy, not major control of the school system. I admit that there's certainly been influence from the left in the curriculum, but it hasn't really taken over the institutions. So I think there's another element here, which is, in my view, more important for explaining something like why did just over 50% of Seattle voters vote for defund the police? Is it because they were reading Gramsci and Marx, or even derivatives thereof? I mean, I don't think so. Again, it's this problem of, on the supply side of ideas and intellectuals, it's absolutely the case that there was a certain amount of this march through the institutions. However, to explain cancel culture, to explain the popularity of some of these ideas, I think you actually have to go to something more basic and emotional, which is this kind of post-Christian left liberal, cultural left liberalism, which says we have to be, first of all, we feel guilty about being white, about being male. So there's white guilt is one pillar of this. A second pillar of this is empathy for the weak. A third pillar is an exaggerated fear of fascism, that somehow if we don't watch it, if we give an inch, if we stop bicycling and pedaling forward, then we're going to wind up back in 1933 Germany, or Jim Crow Alabama, or women in the home and gays in the closet. So these sorts of...
Why do we have that fear, though? Well, it seems like a silly thing to think, but why do we have that?
Well, there's a term called Red Scare to refer to an exaggerated fear of communism and fascist scare. Whereas Red Scare, we had it in the McCarthy period. There was an upsurge in the 1920s, but we've had this almost continual fascist scare, I would argue. And why? You can see the origin of it at a time in the late 1930s when actually there was something to be rather scared about. So I can kind of forgive it in that they overreached a bit in 1930s America, accusing people of being fascists, or at least some of those New York intellectuals who, by the way, the Partisan Review, which Susan Sontag wrote in 1966, was actually in the forefront of some of this. They were accusing like the American scene artists who were just like patriotic American and liberal nationalists of being fascists, for example. That was happening already in the late 1930s, and Truman used this in the late 1940s. It kind of became established, this idea of like accusing people of being a fascist and smelling a fascist under every bed. So that's one part of this, is this exaggerated fear of like, if you allow the right to have any influence at all, we're going to be all marching under the Nazi banner. So very emotional, very reflexive. The other part of this is the white guilt component, or the white male guilt component. And then this very empathetic, you must be kind, be nice. Because if you think about slogans like be kind, that's very much a woke slogan. Very hard to see where that links up to Marx. Because Marx was, if you just take Marx, he was very unwoke in so many ways. I mean, he had nothing but scorn for humanitarians. He thought they were the worst thing in the world. They were just sentimental, syrupy, had nothing to contribute. So the whole Marxist tradition. Now, it's very hard to map the sort of emotional trauma, microaggression type discourse to anything Marxist. I think it's so. What I'm saying is, I think this therapeutic niceness, which comes out of this post-Christian humanitarian liberal left thing, is, I think, the bigger part of the explanation, and then that gets radicalized. Now, of course, it converges with cultural Marxism. So we see kind of some things are from cultural Marxism: gender ideology, critical race theory. That's from cultural Marxism, but all of the, speech codes, affirmative action, emotional safety, all of that is really not coming at all from the cultural Marxist tradition. And I think when someone says, well, we can't let this person speak, the main reason that students and faculty are pushing cancel culture, I still think, is they think it's going to harm somebody emotionally. Not they think this is upholding a structure of oppression that we can't quite see, but if we let them speak, it's going to uphold this system of oppression. This very kind of intellectual cultural Marxist argument, I think, is there for the intellectuals, but I don't think that's the driver of the emotions. And that's my only point, is it's both, but I think the post-Christian left liberalism is the bigger thing.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense, because they both make sense to me. But if you're saying they can both coexist, then
right,
all is well in my mind.
Okay.
Could I ask something completely different?
Sure.
But I'm sure you've got more to come back in towards the end there, Mia. But I do want to ask about it. I noticed that you'd written about the Orange Order in the North.
Yes.
And I'm Irish, and I'm married to a Protestant, and I'm Catholic, and my children are Protestant. And
that's called a mixed
marriage. I know. Mixed marriage. And very unusual to have Protestant children in a mixed marriage, because usually the Catholics win. But that's totally against the grain to do that. Yeah. Very much so. There was a thing from the Catholic Church called the Ne Temera. So always, if there was a mixed marriage, the Catholics always would get the right to raise their children Catholic.
Right.
So great, yeah. So we Catholics kind of beat the Protestants very much in the mixed marriages. But for our marriage, we went against that. My kids are proud. What I want to ask you is about the North, and I've always seen it as almost an exemplar of identity politics. And I wanted to know, did you, and what on earth made you, who's from Canada, you wrote a book about the Orange Order, the most niche, off the wall subject.
Right. Well, this is basically a Protestant fraternity that was founded in Northern Ireland in 1798. But of course, the reason I got interested in it was because of Orangism in Canada, right? And so you may not know that Sir John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada, and at least 4 other Canadian Prime Ministers, including John Diefenbaker, this was already in the 1950s, were members of the Orange Order. And in fact, almost every mayor of Toronto from the 1870s to the 1950s. So this was like an absolutely huge part of Canadian history and society up until not that long ago, the 60s, right?
So what is it, and why is it a huge part of Canadian history? I'm confused.
Because a couple of things. I mean, one is Canada is really the first 200 years of Canada, leaving Quebec aside for a minute. The Canadian state is really a loyalist state, is what it is. It's people who rejected the Republican American Revolution. And so they were Canada is basically founded by American loyalists. And so the whole rationale for Canada is loyalism and unionism. So that's kind of the beginnings. And then, in the 19th century, you had the big wave of immigration from Ireland. which was mainly Protestant, into New Brunswick and Ontario mainly. But then they then move into Manitoba. So they started up the Orange Lodges. And actually, everyone, you had people from the American Loyalist background and Scots, who are a big group in Canada, all joining.
And what is the Orange Order? What is
Order.
it?
It's like it's a sort of Protestant fraternity that believes in loyalty to the crown and Britain. So it's
Can I just add,
yeah,
the tricolour, the Irish tricolour, green, white, and
yeah,
orange. The green would be the Catholic, the white is the peace between,
right,
and the orange is the Protestant. The green, white, and
yeah,
orange.
Oh,
Do you follow
lovely.
me? That's the concept.
yeah.
Didn't work out so well.
So that's kind of, I wanted to see it, what it was like in its kind of origin place. Uh,
Yeah, and it's very unusual. I think people don't quite understand that it's so identity based. They, like back in the day, from let's say in the 1960s to the 2000s, they paint their curbs either red
yeah,
and blue or else green and orange and green or orange to show their kind of sect, to show their tribes.
yeah,
And
Wow.
everything was tribal in the north, like the
yes,
taxi cab you used, the pubs you used, the shops, the schools, everything. And you could talk to somebody, and within 10 seconds, 3 seconds, you would know whether they were Catholic or Protestant. It was incredibly, so it is very much, they lived and breathed identity.
mm,
And you were interested from a historical connection with Canada, but I think you're also interested in something along the lines of the Protestant order, in a way, brought in the kind of be kind and let other people, I suppose, take over.
well, no, this was really a whole separate research.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, I
yeah.
don't think it intersects so much with this, except in so far
I
as
thought that was a leap. I'm glad I'm wrong. It's like, what is he talking about?
except in this regard, except that the Unionists, the Protestants, were already, they felt that they were a very politically incorrect group. And it was interesting because they had devised strategies to reproduce their history of, the history of Protestants in Northern Ireland, which was not really taught in the school system, which was kind of under the UK government. And they had ways of kind of maintaining their collective memory in the face of media opposition and all of this sort of. So it's kind of interesting. So something like critical race theory in Northern Ireland, if they push that in the schools, or let's just say they push something that said the Protestants are a bunch of oppressive bad guys, they had their own history that they taught in the Orange Lodges that would fan out into the youth programs, and so they actually were able to resist the media and the government, and that's kind of interesting too, in a way. I wasn't thinking that as much at the time, but I think it was certainly interesting.
And the concept sectarianism, Mia, everything was sectarian, that's sectarian. And it's just another word, frankly, for tribal with religions. But, I grew up hearing the phrase sectarianism, and I think it should have been called tribalism all along. It was tribal.
That's fascinating. I
Yeah,
learned something. I learned
yeah.
lots actually from this.
This identity thing, though, is, obviously identity's been around. That's been fairly universal. Obviously, people are a bit more into themselves now than they might have been hundreds of years ago. But so the identity component is a bit linked to self-identity. But these groups having their own sense of self, that goes back a long way. Identity on its own, I wouldn't say that I'm radically against that. It's part of the human condition. Like any of these things, you can get sucked into it too much and be too extreme. I don't think identity per se is necessarily the problem, but as so much as a victimhood based identity that gets very radical, where you're all about hating the oppressor, and so you take a very cartoonish view of your enemy as the oppressor, and you dehumanize them.
I think right at the beginning, you said something about you don't really think this is the end of wokeness. And I think I've heard you caution that while it certainly feels to me like we're coming to a sudden, abrupt end of all this nonsense, but then you've cautioned that there are legions of young people fully indoctrinated, graduating, and they're about to enter and take positions of power. So we haven't won yet. But how do you see, how do we get out of this? What are your...
Well, it's very interesting because you're in Canada where woke is very dominant in the institute. There's very little resistance in the political system and in the media system. But what is interesting is that I think maybe amongst the young people in Canada, despite the heavy indoctrination, they don't seem to be as partial to the cultural left as I think in Britain. Actually, the young people are very left wing, more so than Canada. I think what's happening now, you have a mixture of indicators. So if you look at the number of professors canceled by left wing students and activists, that's way down. From 2021, that's really fallen off a cliff. The number of times the New York Times mentions the word racism or white supremacy or sexism, again, dropped off dramatically. So in some of these measures, we really see a decline. But in other things, we don't. Like the number of white Democrats or white liberals who support affirmative action went up during the Great Awakening in the 2010s. Now, it's still only a minority, but it's maybe reached a third or maybe 40%, and it hasn't gone down. So in some regards, this thing has not gone down. And of course, as you know, in Canada and the same in Britain, outside the US, all of these policies remain largely in place. The DEI policies, the companies, only the subsidiaries of the American firms are really cutting back. I do understand that in Toronto, there are somewhat fewer companies supporting the Pride thing.
Yes.
Maybe that, I don't know if that's just the American branch plant firms like Bank of America, or whether that would also include like Royal Bank and Canadian firms. I don't know.
There were some Canadian, they just quietly did not fund it, and then the Pride made a huge big deal. TD and Home Depot, are they Canadian? They're Canadian, right?
Well, Home Depot's not Canadian.
It's
but
not? Okay.
TD is, yeah.
Yeah.
Unless maybe if they have operations in America, fall under U.S. jurisdiction, then maybe. See, this is the thing: is you'd have to get companies that are only operating in Canada, not in both countries. So I think the U.S. influence is curbing it in to some degree in Canada and Britain, where there's a U.S. influence.
Well, wait, so I don't want to end too much on Canadian issues, but I have this thing where I think all of the developments in the US are making things worse for us, because Canadians have the national identity as not being American, right? And especially with Trump, that I fear everything that's happening in the US pushes us further into crazy town.
Yes, it does, but there's different things. So you have, we're not American, but then a lot of other provinces identify against Ottawa. So then, we're not Ottawa. So you kind of like, you see Alberta is pioneering in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, but so it's not entirely clear where that goes. But you're right that the thing is, I think even if Trump hadn't done what he's done, do I think that Canada would change course from being woke theocracy? No, I don't. I think that it doesn't need Trump to do what it's doing. And he's demonstrating, obviously, in a way I don't necessarily approve of, so not in a principled, consistent way. But he is showing that, in fact, you can roll these things back. And that's going to influence the grassroots of the conservative parties, provincially and nationally. And they're going to say, hey, why aren't we doing this? Doug Ford, you're just basically allowing gender ideology in the schools. You're doing nothing. You're useless. So he's going to generate a certain amount of pressure from the grassroots, which might lead, like, I don't know why Ford did make the announcement on, indoctrination in schools, but it might have been that the grassroots was getting more and more restive, and he was facing a lot more pressure from his grassroots to do something. So in that sense, it might be creating some change in Canada, even as it's obviously going to allow the left to say, oh, you're being like Trump. And so it's not clear to me where that's going to wind up.
Okay, my last question. It is the woke left, the whole 60 years, what you're talking about, the whole era is coming to an end. Are you optimistic about what comes next, or are you terrified of what comes next, or a bit of both?
It's hard because you're right. I mean, the kind of populist alternative has not outlined a consistent philosophical alternative, which I think is possible, but clearly that's not happened in the Trump administration, which has mainly been a kind of punitive, attacking particular institutions. It's been kind of incoherent. And you're right, there are obviously crazy people on the right online. I don't use the term woke right. That's a whole other conversation. I don't want to get into it. But yeah, you've got that going on the right. You have on the left, what's encouraging, like on the left, you've got people doubling down the whole Mamdani effect. But then you also have a kind of the intelligent center leftist, the Ezra Klein and the Matthew Iglesias type, who would say, yeah, this was a bad idea, gender ideology, the trans, we've got to get away from this. This is a vote loser. You have those people. I think they're battling it out in the Democratic tent. You have a battle between the kind of Mamdani types and the Iglesias and Klein types, who are kind of sort of trying to inject some sanity in and saying that this is just not where people are. And so that's one battle that's going on. And then I guess, what comes next? I don't know. I'm not scared. I think that it's a good thing that these issues are now entering the political system. When they're not in political debates, then they're behind closed doors and there's no accountability. So it's good that they're involved in electoral politics, which I think will mean that we can get to a place of sanity. It's just that what does the other side look like? What does the right do? Because the right has its own divisions between the classical liberals and between the post-liberals, if you like. And so, for example, and this divide occurs on the higher education front. The classical liberals are much more about free speech, and they don't like what Trump's doing on higher education, whereas the post-liberals are like, well, there's no such thing as neutrality. When they had power, they used it. We've got power. We got to use it. I'm not a fan of that approach, even though I think they have a point that it's true that just a hands-off classical liberal type isn't going to really work. So my hope is what I call a kind of classical liberal realism. So I draw this distinction between the classical liberal idealists like Fire or some of these groups who think that, well, we can persuade, we can use the law, and eventually the universities will reform and the institutions will reform. And I don't believe that's true. I think you need some change of incentives through carrots and sticks. And you do need to use government, but I think as long as you're focused on a goal, that the goal we want to reach is depoliticization, neutrality, balance, then I think that's fine. But I think if the goal is, no, we want to replace their indoctrination with our indoctrination, then I don't think it's going to a good place. So it's a fine balance as to where you want to go.
Could I ask you before we finish, you wrote a beautiful piece that was quite inspiring about you left the University of Birkbeck and you moved to the University of Buckingham. Could you tell our listeners just a little bit about that? And did it make the difference? Like, is it such a different culture? Two different universities in the same country,
It really is a difference. University of Buckingham is what kind of a one of a kind in Britain, in that it was founded as the only private university, basically by Thatcher and neoclassical economists. Now, it's changed over time. It's become much more like other universities in many ways, and the student body and then staff are still, they're left-leaning like other places, but there is a different tradition there, and I think that helps you feel a lot freer. So there's more of a free speech environment there. And I've got a new center for Heterodox Social Science, which is going really well. So that was good. I mean, I think, Birkbeck, where I was for 20 years, it wasn't actually any different from anywhere else. It might even been arguably slightly better than some other places on free speech. But just the fact that, there was one poisonous colleague, very young person who came in, social justice warrior type. And once you're getting, these stories get into the press, then all the interactions become awkward. And so it was just, the kind of easy interactions I'd had with colleagues for many years got more awkward. And and then of course the university fell on hard times, and so that never makes it easy. And that's just another incentive when they're saying, "Oh, your department has to lose 7 out of 15 people," then, there are all these incentives to try to make a move, and so there's kind
Would
of
parents would
yeah,
parents be well advised to kind of suggest the University of Buckingham further if they want their kids out of the identitarian woke?
right, yeah.
Uh,
I think that's they'd have a better chance there, yeah, especially in the graduate programs, it's but really, other than that, in all of the UK. Like Canada, there is no alternative to the mainstream system. So it's about Buckingham's the only option that you have uh, within Britain. Whereas the US has tons, and they've got all these centers that are popping up. Even I understand even Yale and Harvard are creating these schools of civic thought that are going to be uh, pushing a non-progressive, at least a politically neutral, if not even classical liberal perspective. So that's quite exciting, but that doesn't exist outside of America.
Certainly not in Canada. My
Right.
goodness. Okay, well, thank you so much. Wasn't that wonderful? That was
That was
very
Thank
great.
you very
enjoyable.
much.
Thanks, Mia. That was great. Thanks, Stella.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right.